Well, welcome all you wiretappers out there. I'm back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. I have on the Zoom and the on an audio call for the podcast, Charlie Spillers from Oxford, Mississippi. And folks, it's going to be kind of nice to talk to somebody with a little bit of an accent more like mine than all these Northeastern Chicago guys I'm usually talking to. Welcome, Charlie. I'm really glad to have you on.
Thanks so much, Gary. And it's nice to be talking with you. And I found out, like you, when I talk to people from up north, that some people have an accent, but not me.
They do. I know. I tell you what, I put up a podcast. It was really just the audio where I interviewed an Eastern mobster that people hadn't interviewed very much, and a guy named Michael DeLeonardo, who had a great New York accent. And some of those guys from New York, they just denigrated the shit out of me. There's comments about my Rube Cornpone accent.
Just a hick from the stick.
Yeah, that's what they thought. Well, I'll show them. I'm the one interviewing this guy, not them. Anyhow, Charlie has a career somewhat similar to mine. He was a copper and he was a lawyer. And now he's in the true crime entertainment business, if you will. Correct, Charlie?
I think you pinned it. You pinned it just right there.
So anyhow, we always have fun on this show, by the way, Charlie. We like those fun stories, and he's going to tell us some fun stories out of his long career as an undercover officer and an intelligence officer, which, I did intelligence most of my career. I never actually worked undercover where I passed myself off, made drug buys or anything like that. That was for those that could handle it. I think more. I was a guy that would sit in the bar and be unobserved, and in case the shit went down, then I was there to do something or follow their guy there and follow their guy back and follow people around was more my career. But you actually worked undercover, correct?
I did, but don't underestimate yourself. Sitting in a bar nursing a drink requires a lot of skill and talent.
Yes, it does.
Repetitive training.
So anyhow, Charlie has written a book about his life called Confessions of an Undercover Agent: Adventures, Close Calls, and the Toll of a Double Life. And there is a certain toll in that life. We had Giovanni Rocco on, and he talked about the toll. He was a New Jersey policeman, worked undercover quite a while on some of the East Coast mobs. And he talked about the toll that took on his life. This book, New York Times bestseller author Ace Atkins said about this book of Charlie's, Charlie Spillers is a natural born storyteller with a hell of a story to tell. So we look forward to having a hell of a story. We like to say this is out of the mouths of the men that did it. And you're one of the men that did it. Tell us a little bit about your background, where your first law enforcement career was with the Baton Rouge Police Department, correct?
Right, that's right. By the way, the other thing Ace said, the last part of that was, I don't know if Charlie Spillers was brave or just plain crazy. I don't think I go with the crazy part of it. Yeah. I tell you what, a little bit about my background. By the way, the reason that I wrote the book, Confessions of an Undercover Agent, was because after my law enforcement career and while I was a federal prosecutor, for 23 years, career prosecutor, and I worked with dozens and dozens of federal, state, and local agencies and dozens of cases involving undercover, I came to realize that my undercover career was fairly rare. One, because I'd worked undercover so long, about 10 years altogether. And secondly, because I'd worked on so many different groups, different types of criminal groups, from drug traffickers to smugglers, international smugglers, Dixie Mafia, auto theft people, things like that. And so I thought it was a lot of interesting stories that the public would be interested in seeing. Confessions of an Undercover Agent. Yeah. By the way, as you can tell, a haircut makes a lot of difference. I don't quite look like I looked then, right? That haircut.
No, you don't. That does make a difference.
By the way, my last undercover looked a lot different from that. During the almost last year I worked undercover, that's when I was working on a mafia-linked air smuggling operation and Mexican smuggling operation. For my last undercover, I was wearing a three-piece suit, and I portrayed myself as a wealthy businessman, Memphis businessman, who was tied in with organized crime in the Northeast. So, yeah, that picture was me during a lot of my career, except for the last little part of that.
Interesting.
Yeah, as I was saying, I wrote the book because one, I'd worked undercover so long, and two, I'd had different types of criminal groups I worked on. And by the way, unlike a number of people who worked undercover, there were some of us who went from identity to identity. I've used dozens of names and different cover backgrounds and all that. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with who you are. And sometimes you even look in the mirror and you try to remind yourself. But yeah, I fought as a Marine squad leader in Vietnam. And after that, like a lot of people who were in the service, especially Marines, I just missed the excitement. So I went to work for Southern Bell, but then took a pay cut to become a uniformed police officer.
I did too. I took a pay cut to be a copper.
Yeah, exactly. And I joined the Baton Rouge Police Department, and I was on for about 2 months when the captain in charge of the new intelligence division came by to visit me at my apartment and wanted to know if I would volunteer to work undercover.
After 2 months on?
Yeah, after 2 months on. And one reason is because, I wasn't very well known in the Baton Rouge area. And so I had no idea what that meant. But boy, it sounded exciting. So I jumped on and said, yeah, I'd be glad to do it. And he said, well, don't report for your shifts. Stay away from the police department.
Yeah.
And so from then on, that started a 10-year career of working undercover. And my first assignment was basically to infiltrate career criminals in the Baton Rouge area, which was, boy, you talk about a good target. Baton Rouge at that time was so good because you had the mafia influence out of the Marcello family in New Orleans.
Right.
You had organized crime involved in gambling. And you had your high-level criminals involved in different things. And I wound up infiltrating a gang of safe crackers and burglars. They normally
did they provide you with an informant? By this year you're kind of new in your career, so did they provide you with somebody who would interview you in and kind of say, hey, this guy is okay, I know this guy, and then maybe kind of cut him on out after a little bit, maybe, or maybe he sticks with you for a while? How did that work?
Exactly. They provided me with an informant. First of all, I worked undercover, and then eventually they got an informant who was on the fringes.
Yeah.
And I had him introduce me and then cut him out.
Yeah.
And then continue working. So primarily, except for a small period of the informant getting me into certain people, it was just me. And that back in those days, you'll remember this. Back in those days, you didn't work with surveillance when you were deep cover.
Yeah, no.
Because you couldn't.
You couldn't.
Because number one, surveillance couldn't keep up with you all day and all night.
Yeah.
Without being completely burned down. And if surveillance gets burned down, it burns me. So no surveillance. And back during that time, no wires except for, something that was going to be a by bus. So my career then was going to the strip clubs in Baton Rouge. They were nightclubs.
Yeah. And
those were the clubs where the career criminals hung out, and they were like their unofficial headquarters.
Yeah.
So when I would go in the afternoon, show up, they would be at their couple tables and wave me over. And of course, the owner and the dancers and the bar girls, that's where we all gang, and you're part of this close-knit group of nothing but criminals. So anyway, that's how I started. Infiltrate.
Did they provide you with some purported stolen property? Did you get some stuff out of the property room or go buy a bunch of stuff to say, hey, I got this in a score, maybe you can, give them a good deal on or anything? We've done that a lot here.
No, none of that. Later on, though, when I was with the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, and I was working to infiltrate Dixie Mafia auto theft ranks. This was in Northeast Mississippi. And Dixie Mafia, especially in different regions, were especially clannish.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, you just about so difficult to infiltrate them. And we had two sisters who were real thugs themselves. But one of them's daughter had been raped. A little minor daughter had been raped by, one of the Dixie Mafia people, and they wanted to help. Well, they could get me into the fringes, but I knew people wouldn't accept me. So I had the two women lay down stories about me. Mm-hmm. Oh, Mike, I was using the name Mike. Oh, Mike, over in Alabama. Oh, my God, he's so bad. He'll cut off your head and shit on your neck. Mike is terrible. I finally had to tell him, tone it down a little, it down a little. But anyway, they created this picture of me with the criminals before I ever showed up.
Yeah.
So I had them lay down stories for a couple of weeks. And then after I showed up, I went to a Walmart in another town, bought a brand new TV still in the box, and I took it to a pawn shop bail bondsman who I knew was connected with them.
Yeah.
And I told him we had ripped, my people in another state had ripped off a truckload. I said, "Oh, don't worry, it's not around here. No heat on around here."
Yeah.
But we've got, my people have gotten rid of it. I've got a couple left. If you want it, I'll let you have it for $30 or whatever.
Yeah.
And he thought that over, and he looked me over, and he said, "Can you come by after 5 tomorrow when I'm closed?" And I said, yeah. So another time I showed up at his place, and I said, "Oh, come out here to the car." And I opened up the trunk, and in the back were M16s.
Oh,
yeah. And I said, "Hey, I'm a friend of mine or somebody ripped these off in the armory in another state.
Yeah.
I'm taking them somewhere else to get rid of them, but let me know if you ever want one."
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, he went around vouching for me.
Yeah.
And connected me up with a couple of career criminals who later on showed me, about 30 something or 40 big rifles and shotguns and AR-18s they had ripped off a collector and they were trying to sell to me. And then one night we were driving through the back country of Mississippi at night, these back hills, and they were showing me a house. And one of them said, "That's where my grandfather lives."
Yeah.
And he's been ripping people off and doing this and doing that. He's got a safe, and he's probably got 100,000 in it. Said, we want to rob it, but even if we wore ski masks, he'd know it was us. But if you'll do it, and so they were wanting me to rob their. And don't worry, he won't report it to the law. I mean, by the way, of those two initial guys that I got introduced to and ran around, the first of dozens. One of them, they got in a dispute between the two of them, and one of them wound up shooting and killing the other.
Oh boy!
Yeah. Oh. Look. By the way, your viewers might be interested in a key experience I had when I first went undercover in intelligence. And
this will be in your book, right?
Yeah, this is
about your book.
Okay.
Tell us about that first experience undercover. That would be interesting. Kind of skip forward to the Dixie Mafia, but let's go to your first experience. Yeah. Charlie, tell us about your very first undercover assignment. It was you told a little bit of it. It's a heck of a story. Go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, as I was saying, my first assignment in intelligence was to infiltrate career criminals. And not to make cases, but to generate intelligence reports about who is doing what. And leads would be passed to detectives to follow up without them knowing where the information came from. So I'd infiltrated safecrackers and burglars, this gang of them that hung out at a particular strip bar, which was their headquarters. One afternoon, I learned an important lesson about criminals. A very important lesson that helped me throughout my career. I was sitting at the bar with Randy, a safecracker. He was on the bar stool on the right. And between us was Candyman, his associate, sitting on a bar stool. And while we're there, Randy says, "Hey, let me show you something." And he reaches under his shirt and he pulls out a Blue Steel 38. And he says, "I got it last night." And he passes it to Candyman and looks it over. and Candyman passed it to me. And, you know, I'm looking at it and I'm trying to see the serial number, but I can't inside the bar. So I say, hey, Randy, I can use this. Here, and I slip it in my pocket. Hey, I'll give it back to you tomorrow. You know, figuring I'll get the serial number and write the intelligence report on it. Boy, it's like sticking a hornet's nest with a stick. All of a sudden, Randy got infuriated. Give it back, Mike. I was using the name Mike. Give it back, Mike. Give it back. And Candyman turned to me and give it back. And I said, hey, man, I can use it. I'm playing the tough dude. I'll give it back tomorrow. And I take a sip of my beer. And as I'm putting it down, all of a sudden I feel in my right side, something sticking in my right side.
Yeah.
And I look down and it's Candyman. And Candyman has his 38 stuck in my side. And he says, give it back, Mike. Give it back. And I'm thinking, well, he, real fast, I'm thinking, well, he probably won't shoot. We're in a bar. Probably won't shoot. And I said, hey, man, I'll give it back tomorrow. And all of a sudden, I hear click. Click. When you pull back the hammer of a revolver, and it doesn't make a loud click, but if the gun's stuck in your side, it makes a loud click.
Yeah, and that trigger is hair trigger now. Just a little touch of it, and that son of a bitch is off.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I looked down, and his fingers on the trigger, and the hammer's all the way back, and it's stuck in my side. And real quickly, the thought that shot through my mind, that's a word, shot through my mind, was,
really?
Well, he's probably not going to shoot me intentionally, but you know what I'm worried about? I'm worried about, the gun's just going to go off.
Right,
and look, quickly, I'm praying, sneeze, don't cough, don't hiccup, don't anybody just walk past him and happen to bump him with your shoulder. Don't let your finger twitch. And I'm praying, don't let it twitch. And I said, okay, man, okay, I'll give it back. So what I did was, and I moved slowly. I wanted to do it because if I moved too fast, I was afraid to jerk on the trigger. So I said, okay, man. So very deliberately, I put my hand down into my pocket and I pulled the gun out and I passed it past him below the counter to Randy and brought my hand back so he wouldn't jerk. Well, now here came the dangerous part. Here came the real dangerous part. He uncocked it.
Yeah. But
he uncocked it with it still in my side.
Oh,
and of course, your viewers know how you uncock a revolver. You put your thumb on the hammer, pull the trigger, and you try to hold the hammer back, and you try to lower it slowly, because if the hammer slips, bam, it goes off. Or if you lower it too fast, bam, the gun goes off. So he pulled the trigger. And by the way, I told my neighbor, firearms instructor, about this.
Yeah.
And he said, oh yeah. He said, my gosh, on the range, I've had revolver go off twice when I was trying to uncock it.
Yeah.
And so here he is, he's uncocking it. Boy, and my guts are twisted inside, and I'm praying, thumb don't slip. Don't blow it too fast. And you know what? It probably took maybe a full 3 seconds.
Yeah.
For him to lower it all the way until I could unwind. Now think about this, though. Think about this, Gary. For you and I here talking, 3 seconds goes by like this, or somebody said, watching a pretty girl in a park goes by like that. But if you're under the drill in a dentist's office, how long does 3 seconds take? Huh?
3 seconds.
Oh, Lord, man, that was about a lifetime. I mean, and finally he lowered it. And as I was saying, I learned an important lesson.
Yeah.
Right then, early in my career, about criminals. I learned that criminals don't practice firearm safety. and unfortunately, and in my book, there's other examples of criminals not practicing firearm safety. But I learned a lesson then. Well, after I gave the gun back, we were still friends again, but they could be vicious, violent friends at any moment.
Yeah, really.
And that was the example of, by the way, we were talking about my career. To just encapsulate that for your viewers. And I wrote about each of these in the book, a little bit about the background part, but mainly the book is about 10 years undercover. But after serving in the Marines, I was with Baton Rouge PD for 6 years, nearly all of that undercover. And then I was with the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics for 12, 13 years. And the first 5 or 6 years of that was undercover. After that, I became a federal prosecutor for 23 years. Mm-hmm. And while I was a federal prosecutor, I volunteered and served 3 tours in Iraq for the Department of Justice.
Oh, really?
As an attorney advisor to the Iraqi court that tried Saddam and other high-level regime leaders. And on my 3rd tour of Iraq, I was the U.S. Department Justice Attaché for Iraq, working with the Iraqi government, the governments of other nations, and of course the military, the embassy, and all that. My work in Iraq was commended by the FBI director, by the Deputy Attorney General, by Britain's Minister of State for the Armed Forces, and also my work was commended by the British ambassador. Well, you know, and those of your viewers who have been in law enforcement know that we love those commendations, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, we love them.
Yeah.
And I used to think those commendations meant something.
Yeah.
But then I came back from the grocery store back several months ago.
Yeah.
And as I got back from the grocery store here, I put the groceries on the counter and I turned away and my wife was going through the bags, putting stuff away. And behind her, I heard her say, "The milk." I said, "Huh?" She said, "The milk." I said, "What about the milk?" She said, "Where's the milk?" And I said, "Well, it's in a bag." "I don't see the milk." And I said, "But the milk's not here." I said, "But no, the milk's not here." I said, "But it's not." She said, "No, you forgot the milk." I said, but I've been commended by the British ambassador.
Yeah. Oh, whoop-de-doo.
She said, "I don't care. You forgot the milk." And so, I mean, that was a good reminder.
Yeah.
That no matter how many commendations you've received, no matter how many thousands of copies your book has sold, you still have to remember, one, what to pick up at the grocery store. Number two, you still have to put out the trash can on trash day, like I did this morning.
Yeah.
And you still have to pay full price, or in my case, senior price for a cup of coffee somewhere. So those commendations don't mean much.
Yeah,
and
really.
as your law enforcement viewers know, one all crap letter wipes out a dozen data boy letters, right?
Yeah.
Hey, we know about this from the profession, don't we?
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, it doesn't matter what kind of danger you get yourself into on the job. When you go home, you still have to remember to go get the milk. They don't even want to hear about that danger shit.
Oh my God. Yeah. My wife used to ask sometimes, especially about Iraq, "Isn't that dangerous?" I said, "Dangerous?" I said, "Hell, if it was dangerous, I wouldn't be going."
You must be married to a saint like I am.
Yeah. Somebody once said, "Hey, when you were working, did anybody ever shoot at you?" And I said, "You mean they shoot at you?" Man, if I'd known that, I never would have done that kind of work.
Really. So when you were working in Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics, then I guess did you have much? You run into any mafia guys out of New Orleans involved in narcotics, or was it Mexican cartels primarily? You got some stories out of that?
Well, the link, my link to the mafia was an indirect link. I never dealt directly with the mafia guys, but what I did deal with undercover were pilots that flew in plane loads of dope for the Marcello mafia family. And I got introduced to one of the pilots up here, or a couple of them up here in North Mississippi, and that's when I was pretending to be a wealthy Memphis businessman tied in with organized crime in the Northeast. And the good thing about it is the pilot just totally trusted me and told me all about, what he was doing and when the next plane load would be and the organization that he worked for and things like that. Basically, the Marcellos had about 6 crews flying in plane loads of drugs for them. And the crews would fly down to Jamaica and other countries and fly back like 1,600 pounds of marijuana or fly back other drugs, cocaine. And this particular pilot was getting like a set fee per trip, which was, I forget, it was something like $60,000 per trip, which in today's money would be about, maybe 150, 200,000 per trip. But good thing about it is he would tell me, thinking I was going to buy a plane load from him on the side, he would tell me about what he was doing. So we were able to identify airfields down on the Mississippi coast, Louisiana, and other places where he had contacts or had people at the airfield bought off, and where they would regularly fly in loads. So that's how I connected up. He flew down while I was dealing with him. He was telling me about a trip he was going to take. So he flew down to Jamaica. And on his way back, he ran into headwinds. He was flying a twin Beech aircraft. On the way back, he ran into headwinds, ran low on fuel, and he landed in Belize. And the authorities in Belize at the airport seized the plane with 1,600 pounds of dope marijuana on it and arrested him and his co-pilot. His partner here called me and said, "Oh, Mike," I was using the name Mike again. He said, "Mike, here's what's happened. Here's what happened." Well, the day after they got arrested in Belize, a Lear jet left New Orleans with, I think it was 8 people on it, including an attorney who had done a lot of work for the Marcello organization and a couple other people with Link. They flew down there. They were sitting in the courtroom whenever this guy had his hearing, a day or two later. And he was down there. The pilot I dealt with, his name was Mahaffey. He was down there for about a week and a half, then made his way back to U.S. and met with me and told me all about it. And he said the people that flew down tried to buy up all the paperwork so there'd be no record of him being arrested. But he said they weren't able to buy up all the paperwork, but it turned out good that he got arrested. He said, because we made contact with a minister in the government. and we could probably in the future just fly to Belize and pick up plane loads there, but we'll have to wait a while. And then he went on to explain that he was supposed to be in jail or prison for 90 days in Belize, but the Belize authorities secretly took him to the Mexican border and let him loose, after his people paid money to take care of all that. But anyway, he was telling me about all that. And then later on, some of those same people that were in that Lear jet flew to, I'm trying to remember, I think it was Grand Cayman. And they came back, and when they came back and landed at the New Orleans airport, Customs found envelope with $150,000 in cash. None of the men on the plane would claim the money. Finally, one of them, who was an attorney, finally said, "Okay, I'll claim it." He claimed it. Well, what happened was, about a week later, a couple of men who were on that plane went to Oklahoma and paid, I think it was $180,000 cash for an Aero Commander airplane. And then the guy I was dealing with, that was going to be his plane. And then he took off on another trip to Jamaica to pick up a plane load. Only by that time, we had a transponder on the plane. He was being tracked.
Wow.
When he flew back, here's another mafia connection for you. When he flew back, he landed at, I believe it was Franklinton, Louisiana, just briefly, and the bales were offloaded into vans. The tracking plane and Customs were behind him by a few minutes, and they saw the van leaving, and they were able to have agents follow the van. And meanwhile, he flew the empty plane to Diamond Head, landed it there, and they cleaned it out and vacuumed it out. Put the seats back in it. And he got in his vehicle and drove back up to North Mississippi where he lived. Meanwhile, the agents that night, they had followed the load to where it went, and it went to this warehouse built in the middle of the woods. And that night, DEA, Louisiana State Police, other agents hit it. And they got about 750 pounds of marijuana. The rest had been gone. So they got that. They didn't seize the plane because if they did, that might tip him off.
Yeah.
That infiltrate him. But they seized the dope. After they seized the dope, and I met with the pilot Mahaffey, he was telling me about that. And he said, here's what happened. He said there were 2 boatloads that brought in tons of dope via Pontchartrain, Lake Pontchartrain.
Yeah.
And he said they went to the warehouse. And he said, we think what happened is one of those boatloads of dope was tracked. Mm-hmm. And by the time they hit it, all the boatloads were out and part of my load was still there. And I said, oh, okay.
Thank you, God. Thank you, Jesus.
Thank you, Jesus. By the way, one of the 8 or 9 people who were arrested at the warehouse was Nofio Pecora Jr. His dad was a capo for the Marcello Mafia family. And his dad was a capo for the Marcello Mafia family. And his mother, despite those organized crime connections, his mother had been the state insurance rating commissioner. Well, that tells
politics and the mob.
Yeah, that tells you something about Louisiana. But interestingly enough, after he got arrested, I believe it was his mother. One of them was caught trying to bribe either the sheriff or the DA and charged. Meanwhile, the capo's son fled, and he was arrested in London 13 years later running a pub. And as I wrote in the book, as I wrote in Confessions of an Undercover Agent, one of the newspapers in the country had the most creative headline. It said, Grog Father arrested in London instead of Godfather, Grog Father. Anyway, that was some exciting times.
Yeah, really. I see here, just looking online there, Nofio Pecora Sr. was a longtime capo, and this was his son.
That was his son, yeah. That was his son. And here's one silver lining about drugs. There's not really any. But the one thing about it is, as the mob and some organizations started getting into drugs and had not been into drugs before, it was bad news, but it also gave law enforcement opportunities to make cases on people that they couldn't have gotten to through other crimes. So that wound up good. Yeah, I think
they were also that family, according to this case I found online, they were involved with insurance. She was the state insurance
commissioner, rating and insurance commissioner. Yeah.
And they did some kind of scam. I won't go into some kind of scam with insurance. So I tell you what, the mob and politics, you can't have a mafia family, successful mafia family without the political element. They don't survive very well without the political element.
Right. That's exactly right. Actually, by the way, when I worked undercover on the Gulf Coast, prior to being a wealthy businessman in Memphis, when I started working undercover on the Gulf Coast, I drove a taxi as a cover to break into the heroin trafficking groups down there. I drove a taxi, and then I started laying down a story that I was waiting on this big insurance settlement. I was telling the drug traffickers that. And then finally, I was real happy because I got it and I could quit driving. I started driving this big Lincoln. That was back in the days when the Lincolns looked like a big cabin cruiser going down the road. You know, they're about 30 feet long, and when you went to make a turn, it was almost like turning a ship. I mean, those things were huge, and I had all the money in the world to buy heroin. But back during the time I was working on the coast undercover, the coast was populated not by casinos, but by strip clubs. And Dixie Mafia was very active. And the Marcello organization and the Tropicana organization out of Florida, they had, as I remember, they had an agreement to share the Gulf Coast. So they had their own interests. And of course, the sheriff, Leroy Hobbs, there on the Gulf Coast, was one of the people that was connected with the criminals. And later on, DEA or the FBI was able to make a reverse undercover case on him involving dope. But the coast was wide open back then. And like I say, Dixie Mafia and two mafia families were very active here in those times. In fact, I remember one of the guys I was working on, Dewey D'Angelo, who had a bar. I had to stop working on him after a while because he wound up in the trunk of a car with a few bullet holes in his head. You know, the typical type thing.
Yeah. Anytime you find a guy here north of the river shot up in the trunk of his car, you know it's probably a mob hit the same way down there. Now, I have let's talk just a minute about this Dixie Mafia. I know I've talked with there's a lady Sonova Cantrell that has written a book on Kirksey Nicks and some people like that, and I'm sure you've heard of them. And I think they were responsible. They killed a judge and his wife down there in a kind of a mistaken deal that the judge's law partner had taken some money from one of them from, I think this Nick.
The Sherry murders. Yeah,
the Sherry murders, and so kind of like. I know there was an attorney general in Kansas that wrote kind of an intelligence report about the Dixie Mafia. And it's, kind of from your view, how would you define that? How would you explain when you say the Dixie Mafia? It's not, it's not this pyramidal kind of a thing that goes all the way to the commission in New York City, like the La Cosa Nostra Mafia. It's a little bit different. So how would you explain that, Charlie?
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with it, Gary. For your viewers who are not, it's primarily a network of career criminals. And on this network of career criminals spread across several states, primarily in the South and Southeast, but very active in surrounding states, they'll come together tightly in some close-knit conspiracies to commit this crime or that crime. And then they'll, filter back to what they're normally doing. Okay. And then when somebody else has something like for instance, in Mississippi, let's say here in North Mississippi, let's say one of them in a small town, and I'm going by something that's actually happened. Let's say one of them in a small town south of Oxford gets in touch with others in Oklahoma or around the country and says, look, there's somebody lives out here in the county that I think probably has a safe and a lot of money. And I can't do it myself, but I need somebody to come down, and do the robbery and or kill him. And then the others will come down and they'll go break into the house and do the robbery with ski masks or do the robbery and murder and then leave. Mm-hmm. And there will be dead bodies and there will be no clues, or there'll be somebody who's been robbed and may be able to report it or may not, because maybe the money, like the guy's grandfather, maybe the money they accumulated wasn't completely legit. So they'll come together for things like that. Okay. And they'll call on others for hits. They'll call on others for armed robberies. They'll rob poker games. They'll rob residences, especially. They're some of the most, I'm about to say they're some of the most violent criminals, but they're violent. They will kick. Now, by the way, the people I was dealing with, I wrote about this in the book, people I was dealing with in Northeast Mississippi who were part of Dixie Mafia auto theft rings, they would, I think I wrote an example in the book that in just 1 week, the people I dealt with had told me about this, and this, and that. I mean, so many crimes, from child pornography to insurance fraud to burning down a house or trailer, after taking the good furniture out to collect insurance money, or an insurance person in connection with them, or a law enforcement sheriff or officer they had paid off. I mean, I that's in the book about just 1 week of that. There was so much stuff they were doing that it was hard for me to keep up with in intelligence reports. I was buying stolen cars. I think I'd bought about 20, about maybe almost 30 stolen cars from brand new BMW stolen off the lot in Chicago and brought straight down. A tractor trailer truck full of 200 boxes of furniture from a furniture plant in North Mississippi, the truck and the furniture for like $4,400, dynamite, sawed-off shotgun, buying stuff right and left. It was hard to keep up with them. But these same people I was dealing with, they would sometimes brag to me about, about killings and things like that. And as I pointed out in the book, citizens every day, you get up and you're cutting your grass and you're going to work, perhaps you're going to church on Sundays and you're doing this and doing that. Well, below that layer is the underworld.
Yeah.
And the underworld, as you know, and many of your listeners know, the underworld is composed of career criminals. And 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all they do is prey on honest people. And they steal from them, they hurt them, and sometimes kill them. But that's all they do. And when we're in law enforcement, here's the great thing about it, Gary. When you were working in law enforcement, and when I was working with Baton Rouge PD and MBN, later on as a federal prosecutor, good thing about it is we get to target people like that, right? And work on them and try to make cases on them. And the key thing about that is you were in intelligence, I was too, is you have that intelligence and you know who the most violent criminals or the biggest criminals are, career criminals. The good thing about it is you know it through your intelligence collection and you start working on them to try to make those cases. And it's satisfying to be able to take people like that off the streets. As I tell people, there's the people we work on, they're going to be committing crimes as long as they're not in prison. And in prison, they'll be preying on other people, but they won't be committing crimes. So I think one time at a drug trial, as a federal prosecutor, after the guy was convicted after trial, that his defense attorney says, "Well, do you think you're going to solve the drug problem by sending my client off to prison?" I said, "No, but I know he won't be doing it." Well, look, think about it. The same thing applies to burglary. Do you think you're going to solve the burglary problem by sending my client to prison? No, but he won't be doing it, right?
He won't be doing it.
Right. He won't be doing it. So anyway, it's great and it's satisfying to be a professional in law enforcement, working on professional criminals and career criminals like that. The 20% who commit 80% of the crimes are responsible for 80% of the crimes, and get those people off the streets. When we worked on the street gangs in Clarksdale, Mississippi, a little town of 20,000, a small town of 20,000 might normally have maybe 8 armed robberies a year.
Yeah. That
town in 14 months had 77 armed robberies. Damn. 77 in a year. One convenience store got robbed twice in the same night. The police had just left from taking care of a prior when an hour later, another group of armed robbers, the gangs had overridden that town. They were looking into buying an anti-tank weapon, shoulder fired, to blow up a police car. They were looking into buying night vision goggles, and they already had automatic weapons, fully automatic AR-15, and they would run armed patrols at night in their territory. 7 or 8 of them would put on dark clothing. They would get their automatic weapons, and they would go on patrols through the alleyway of their territory. And every now and then, they would go to an opposing gang member's house at night or early morning hours. They'd surround the house, and on the count of 3, they'd blast away. I mean, they had dominated the town and overrun them. The good thing about that is working with the PD and others, we were able to identify the main trigger pullers, and we were able to make federal cases on them to where they would be picked up, taken from Clarksdale to Oxford, and held without bond because they were dangerous, held without bond pending trial. instead of under the state system where they would get arrested and an hour later be back on the street.
Yeah.
So we started working together. We started having that impact by taking trigger pullers off the street. And after a while, when we'd be out at night and we'd tell somebody on the street, well, you know what'll happen to you if we take you to Oxford? They said, yeah, we ain't coming back. And we said, yeah, that's right. I mean, that's what it takes to have an impact, a concerted effort of everybody working together and just focusing on the most violent people.
Yeah.
But anyway,
it's kind of the same thing that happened in Kansas City. Now, this had to be during this time when we formed a task force called the LA Boys Task Force, because what happened was the street gangs in LA, they started coming out because there was such a concentration, and they went back to where some of their families came from. That'd be Kansas City, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Portland, Omaha, throughout the Midwest. Their families had gone out to LA, maybe, the last generation, but they had relatives back here. So they started coming back, and they brought those LA ways with them and that organization with them. We had the same thing here and started, and they had this line set up to get drugs, get cocaine, and the crack cocaine thing was going on at the time. So it was, there was some dicey times there in the 80s and especially the 80s. And we worked out here in Kansas City. And plus Jamaicans came to town too, and had this line of narcotics all ready to go in here. And there were some violent times in the 80s. And you're right, you have to work with the feds and get that 5-year sentence for that felon in possession of firearms, a big one. Boy, that's when they don't come back, because they set a high bond on it. They just don't come back for a long time.
Right. Oh, those federal twos are so good. Yeah. And having been with the PD, having been with the state, I really appreciate the twos as a federal prosecutor and being able to use them. I felt like an investigator with subpoena power. I mean, it was great to work on people like that. But violent street gangs, they require a concerted effort. Yeah. And the little town I was talking about, Clarksdale, it was either 7 or 8 different street gangs, several forms of vice lord, gangster disciples, and the vice lords were connected straight back to Chicago.
Yeah.
And they had I forget what it's called, their writ or manifesto, or whatever it is, straight from Chicago. And sometimes their beefs would go back up that way.
Yeah.
But they were involved in a lot of murders, a lot of drug trafficking. But we were finally able to disrupt and dismantle street gangs and drive the violent crime down. Now, after we spent 2 years doing that and were highly successful, we let up and left it back to the locals. Unfortunately, after a couple of years, though, it crept back up. It's the kind of thing that you have to stay on. You have to stay on. I'll get off my soapbox.
Okay. Now Clarksdale, that's the crossroads. Those of you who are blues fans out there, they have I think it's got the National Blues Museum and the what's the place that Morgan Freeman owns down there? It's like a modern kind of a
club,
juke joint.
Club Zero.
Ground Zero.
Zero,
and the Blues Museum down there. It's really cute, quaint little town, and supposedly there's a guy named Robert Johnson who sold his soul to the devil down at the crossroads, which was in Clarksdale to be the best blues player ever. Now, just a little aside, folks, for you blues fans out there, it's Clarksdale, Mississippi. Right. And then you had West Helena right down the road a piece. They always have the the King Biscuit blues festival every year. Have you ever been to that?
I'm looking on my wall. There's a poster from the 1988 King Biscuit Blues Festival. My son and his fiance had gone to it and brought back that.
So this area is colorful, to say the least. You got the Dixie Mafia, now you got street gangs coming in. You've got this long time blues history. Highway 61 goes right down through there. Bob Dylan song, Highway 61 Revisited. I mean, it's a really cool area. And Oxford is the coolest town you ever wanted to be in. I'll tell you, folks, it's like you went back to southern town in what the turn of the century southern town, or maybe even a little bit earlier. It's a really quaint, not quaint, maybe a romantic kind of an area, that northern Mississippi. I love northern Mississippi.
Charming. Is
That's
the
a
word.
good word.
Charming,
That's the
yeah.
word I was looking for. Holly Springs, like I said, and you know, they say Memphis is the biggest city in Mississippi. Is that right?
I think that's about right. Gary, Oxford is such a great place that when I was federal prosecutor, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Virgin Islands wanted me to transfer down there. And I agreed, and we were just 4 days away from getting on a plane to go down and find a house in the Virgin Islands.
Oh my God!
Transfer. And now 4 days before we were to do that, I called the Virgin Islands, the U.S. Attorney's Office there, and said, "Gosh, I've changed my mind. I'm sorry. We just can't leave Oxford. Life is nice. Too good. Life is too good here."
Yeah.
I was very pleased because soon after Confessions of an Undercover Agent was released, by the way, it was published by University Press of Mississippi.
Yeah.
Can you? And which is, which a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know until when I got involved with it. That's the publishing arm for our state university system, our 8 state universities, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, 6 other state universities. Yeah. They published Confessions of an Undercover Agent. Soon after it came out, it was declared, Amazon declared it the number 1 release in law enforcement books.
Yeah.
And Mississippi keeps track of the best-selling books in the state.
Uh-huh.
And every week they release the top 10 list of the best-selling books. And it was on the top 10 best-selling books list for about 5 or 6 months after its release, and it kept reappearing on the list year after year. And in fact, I was at Square Books yesterday signing more copies of it that had just come in. It's been out several years, but it's as popular as ever, which I'm thankful for. Yeah, there I am. Yeah, a haircut does make quite a difference, doesn't it? I mean,
man, it's almost hard to see you, and looking at both of them, like, well, I guess that's him.
Yeah.
I guess you got a little older too.
Yeah, I think you're right. By the way, for the people who haven't gotten the book yet, there are photographs in the book itself, right in the middle of it, of from undercover and from later on, and also from Vietnam. And later on as a federal prosecutor. The book, I put just a few pages about Vietnam because the publisher wanted me to put a little bit of background.
Oh, yeah.
One other thing about the book, by the way, I wrote about other agents too. I worked with some of the most extraordinary and the most courageous agents ever in Baton Rouge and with the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics. And I wrote also about their experiences.
Cool. A lot of good stories in there.
Oh, there are. They're not only my friends, but they're people that I admire and people who I think everyone would agree are real heroes, just amazing people.
Okay, Charlie, folks, the book is Confessions of an Undercover Agent, Adventure, Close Calls, and the Toll of a Double Life by Charlie Spillers, who we've just had on the show. And get to Amazon.com. I'll have links on the show notes to take you right to the Amazon page. If you want a signed copy, probably have to go down to Oxford, Mississippi, to the Square Books. And I want to tell you something, that Square Books is the coolest bookstore I was ever in. Also, that I just love Oxford, Mississippi.
By the way, Gary, that you might be aware of the fact Square Books was recognized by the Independent Booksellers Association as the #1 bookstore in the nation.
I mean,
it is remarkable. And if you do want that book signed, how about if I meet you in Destin? Would you do it there?
Really? Well, I'm going down to Cocoa Beach here later on in the year. So
oh, well, good for you.
I tell you what, if I ever get back down around the Mid-South there, I'm gonna look you up, Charlie.
Oh, look, do that, and we'll get together for lunch, dinner, beers, or whatever.
If you ever get to Kansas City, why you ever have any reason to come up in Kansas City, be sure and give me a call.
I'll do that. And thanks for having me on your program.
All right, Charlie. Well,
been a pleasure. Been a pleasure.
Right. Thank you. Nice talking to you. Bye.
Thank you, Gary. Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode of Gangland Wire. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe down below if you're on YouTube. Now, I started on YouTube, as you all have noticed, I would imagine. If you're on an audio platform like the Apple Podcast app, you can give me a review there. I appreciate that. You can also support the making of each episode by buying me a shot and a beer on your Venmo app. If you have Venmo, that's at Gangland Wire. I have a new way, buy me a cup of coffee. There's a link in the show notes to buy me a cup of coffee or two. You can go to my website. You can see all my books and movies that are for sale, or you can donate via your credit card on the PayPal button, or if you have a PayPal account. And if you donate enough, why, you start getting those books and movies in a coffee cup or a t-shirt or whatever you want. And remember, if you are a friend or suffering from PTSD, check out the Veterans Administration resources. Just go to Google and Google PTSD and Veterans Administration, or VA, and you'll find that website. And you'll find there's a hotline and there's links there to help you find resources to deal with that problem. And remember to look out for motorcycles on the road and stay safe. Bye, folks. Music provided by our good friend and super fan from Portland, Oregon, Casey McBride. Thanks, Casey.